My name is Barbara McCaskill. I'm a professor of English at the University of Georgia and Associate Academic Director at the Willson Center for Humanities and Arts. I am very excited about this panel. I want to talk to you a little bit about the context out of which this panel has arisen. One reason I'm absolutely over the moon about this panel is that it is the very first of what we plan to be many important public conversations that comes out of a new partnership between the University of Georgia, Willson Center for Humanities and Arts, and the Penn Center National Historic Landmark District. This partnership will result in many public conversations about issues germane to African American coastal communities in Georgia, South Carolina, and Florida. It is part of a mixture of many programs that the University of Georgia and the Penn Center will embark upon over the next few years, thanks to the generous funding of the Mellon Foundation. These programs include not only the public conversations, but visiting artist residencies, as well as annual opportunities for young people, for university and college students from both public and private, as well as historically Black and predominantly white colleges and universities to come together at the Penn Center every summer in May and June, and to think about global challenges of our time connected to coastal Black communities, as well as to interact with each other in ways that we traditionally do not do. I'm very excited about all of these projects. So what I would like to do right now is introduce all of the panelists as well as our moderator to you. I will begin with our moderator, Rosalind Bentley, and I'd like to welcome Rosalyn not only to the panel to moderate it, but I would also like to welcome you as a new colleague of mine at the University of Georgia. I just learned about that this morning, and I am thrilled that you will literally be across the street from where I work in the Grady School of Journalism at the University of Georgia. So Rosalind Bentley is our distinguished moderator for today's panel on Heirs Property. She is now the interim director of the Narrative Nonfiction MFA program in the Grady College of Journalism and Mass Communication at the University of Georgia. Previously, she worked as an enterprise reporter and senior culture writer at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution and the Minneapolis Star-Tribune. She was also a columnist for the Southern Foodway Alliance's award-winning journal titled Gravy. A graduate of Florida A&M University, she received her MFA in narrative nonfiction from the University of Georgia. Her essay on her own family's issues with heirs property was recognized in Best American Essays, the 2021 edition. Her work has been anthologized in Best American Newspaper Narratives, and she has written for the New York Times, the Oxford American, Long Reads, and Essence Magazine, among others. She is a two-time James Beard Award finalist and also a Pulitzer Prize finalist for the Issues of Race project exploring race relations in Minnesota. Her essay entitled Iron and Brass will appear in fall in the book Bigger Than Bravery, Black Resilience and Reclamation in a Time of Pandemic, edited by our late and much missed colleague at the University of Georgia, Dr. Valerie Boyd. So welcome, Rosalind Bentley. We're very honored and thrilled to have you as moderator of this panel today. I'm moving in alphabetical order now, not being any respecter of persons here, moving through the panelists list, just to introduce you to all of the people that have given so generously of their time to come in today into this webinar to talk about heirs property issues. First, we have Emory Campbell, who is a native of Hilton Head Island, South Carolina, and attended Penn Center when it was known as Penn School. And as many of you watching may know, one of the reasons why Penn Center is a National Historic District is that it is one of the first schools in the South where formerly enslaved persons and their descendants could receive an education. Penn Center has been continuously running since 1862, and along with Atlanta's Auburn Avenue district, it is the only one of just two National Historic Landmark districts in the country focused on African Americans. And Mr. Campbell has a long relationship with Penn Center. In 1980, he became the executive director of Penn Center and vigorously embarked on programs to revive the center's historical significance and its educational programs and preserve the cultural and environmental assets of the Sea Islands. To help achieve this, he has organized the nationally recognized Penn Center Heritage Days celebration. He has appeared in many documentaries, news magazines, films, and radio and television programs, including 60 Minutes, The Today Show, a PBS special titled Family Across the Sea, as well as C-SPAN's important Washington Journal. He has been awarded the Governor's Award for Historical Preservation and was inducted into the South Carolina Black Hall of Fame. He was awarded the Carter G. Woodson Award for Civil Rights by the National Education Association in 2006. He is author of 2 books that I'm very pleased to say that we will be assigning the students in our very first summer student research residencies at the Penn Center this summer. Those books are the guidebook titled Gullah Cultural Legacies, which has gone into its 3rd edition, and he has co-authored the book Gullah Days, Hilton Head Island Before the Bridge, 1861 to 1956. He retired from Penn Center in 2002 after a long 22 years of service, but he is not done serving. He is currently president of the Gullah Heritage Consulting Service, where he conducts institutes on Gullah cultural heritage and related issues through lectures, short courses, and the Gullah Heritage Trail Tours on Hilton Head Island. So welcome, Emory Campbell. Cherise Handy, Cherise T. Handy, is the founder of Heritage Law Firm PC. She is known for her extensive knowledge of land titles and heirs property. She also was born and raised in the Low Country of Beaufort County, South Carolina, where she knows all too well of the property issues resulting from heirs property and other issues regarding title to family-owned property. She began her legal career upon obtaining an associate degree in paralegal studies from the Technical College of the Low Country. After that, she worked as a real estate paralegal. She worked as a title abstractor for several title companies and law firms before establishing her own title company, Heritage Title Abstracting Services. At Heritage Title, Charisse has performed thousands of title searches for various law firms and lenders. Before becoming a licensed attorney, she became an expert in land titles and has rendered expert testimony in numerous cases involving land titles and property ownership rights. She has pursued a lifelong goal of being an attorney, earning a bachelor's degree at Park University in Parksville, Missouri, and a JD, Juris Doctorate, at Savannah Law School in Savannah, Georgia. She returned after that to her hometown to practice law and serve the community she loves. Welcome, Cherise T. Handy. Odetta MacLeish-White is our next panelist. She is director of the Georgia Initiatives for the Center for Community Progress, America's nonprofit leader for turning vacant spaces into vibrant places. I love that slogan. She is an alumna of Duke University School of Law, where she also received a JD and LLM in international law. She earned her bachelor's degree in English and American Literature and Language from Harvard Radcliffe University. In 2018, she was a Salzburg Global Seminar Fellow in the Building Healthy, Equitable Communities, the Role of Inclusive Urban Development and Investment cohort. That experience culminated in her co-authorship of a statement on power and privilege in community development, which was published by the Salzburg Global Seminar and the British Journal of Medicine. Her career in affordable housing and community development was ignited by her time working for a developer in Gainesville, Florida, which taught her that it was possible to make beautiful housing accessible and affordable to everyone. Over her 20-year career, she has worked in affordable housing development, policy, and financing, most recently as managing director of the Transformation Alliance, which is a partnership of nonprofits, government agencies, and businesses working to strengthen communities through transit in metropolitan Atlanta. In addition to this work, she serves as co-chair of the Prioritizing Communities Work Group for the House ATL Initiative and on the City of Atlanta's Clean Energy Advisory Board. She has also served on the board of the League of Women Voters of the United States Board of Directors and on the board of Georgia Advancing Communities. Welcome, Odetta. And finally, last but certainly not least, is Commissioner Mitch Mitchell. He took office in City Council in December 2020. He is a proud graduate of Robert Smalls High School in South Carolina State College, where he received his BS in Business Administration and was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the United States Marine Corps. He has lived a dual professional career as a military officer and commercial airline pilot. After 33 years of military service, he retired from the United States Air Force as a major general. After more than 34 years as a commercial airline pilot, he retired from Alaska Airlines as a senior captain and the Federal Aviation Administration as a pilot check airman. He has served as a Beaufort History Museum and Penn Center trustee on the Beaufort County Planning Commission and as a community organizer. And I would like to give special thanks to Councilman and Major General, once a Major General, always a General, Mitch Mitchell, for your service. I come from a military family. My dad was a colonel in the United States Army. I know what that entails. Thank you so much for your ongoing service. And I would like to thank everyone on this panel. As you can see, audience members, we have a very distinguished panel of people who are well-versed in heirs property issues and still doing the work to make sure that people hold on to their lands and have access to land and property ownership. Before I hand the baton to our moderator, Rosalind Bentley, I would like to establish a few rules of the road. Audience members, as you think of questions, please place your questions in the Q&A. I promise I'll jump back into this conversation and give you time to share your questions. I will lob your questions to the panelists on your behalf. So please, as you think of questions, put them in the Q&A, and I'll make sure to make time for the panelists to attend to your questions. So without further ado, I'd like to hand the panel over to Rosalyn. Thank you so much.
And thank you, Barbara. Thank you very much for such generous and wonderful introductions. So I feel like I know everyone already. But I also want to thank everyone out there for joining us. we know that this is going to be a very lively and meaningful discussion about one of the great issues plaguing Black families across this country, but particularly in the South and particularly in Low Country. And that issue is land loss through heirs property. But before we dive right in, I do want to again thank the Penn Center, the University of Georgia Willson Center for Humanity and Arts, and also the Andrew Mellon Foundation for their support and diligence in arranging this panel. So again, a thank you. So let's just kind of jump right in, but I want to start with a level set, and that is most people viewing this, and certainly all of our panelists know what heirs property is, but I would love for a couple to jump in right now, and let's start with both a colloquial definition of what heirs property is, what most people might think it is, but maybe they don't have the language for. And then let's talk about the very real legal definition of what that is. So I'm going to first toss it to Odetta and ask you if you would.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Rosalind. I am honored to be on this panel. I am actually quite early in my learning process around heirs property, but having been in this job for just over a year, but it was within about 3 months of starting that the question of heirs property was placed right in the middle of my dashboard as a state director looking to deal with vacancy, abandonment, and deterioration, and how to support municipalities and communities in thinking about VAD, vacant, abandoned, deteriorating property, VADs. For me, heirs property is the, I don't know if this is colloquial enough, but it's like the visible symptom of a lot of systemic problems. And some of the systemic problems might reside within a family dynamic, trying to figure out who owns what and who has access to what rights. But there are so many reasons why Black families in particular find themselves having to kind of fight each other for part ownership of a single piece of property, as opposed to having the ability to garner more property for the family. So I think it is like the outward expression of a lot of institutional and structural racism that we can certainly unpack as we go forward with the panel.
Okay. All right. Cherise?
Yes, thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure and an honor of mine. I focus my practice on preserving heirs property, quiet title actions, partition actions, probate administration, and legal education as to how to preserve family property. And heirs property, as distinguished from heirs property, where you have property that's passed to known descendants. There's a difference between the legal term heirs property, where the property has passed throughout family members, descendants throughout the years with no legal title. So there's no evidence of ownership. There's never been any type of proceedings or court order to ascertain the heirs. Therefore, heirs property in this context means that the interests are so diluted among many, many, many family members, known and unknown, which creates the problem and makes heirs property vulnerable, especially to opportunistic developers, which I'm sure we will get into in this conversation. And it's problematic because the family wants to preserve the property and leave it in the family name. However, it makes the property easier to loss and family displacement.
Got it. So we're really talking about that land that great grandma Ophelia left so that if anybody needed a place to stay, you could come and put, maybe a trailer on it, or you could just stay there, or anybody who needed a place to stay, but not leaving that in a will, not expressly saying that, then through the years, it becomes legally vulnerable. Is that correct?
Absolutely. And in our community, Low Country, and Black communities in general, we hold very high regards to our elders. That's something that was brought over through culture from West Africa. Sir, no sir, ma'am, yes ma'am, miss, mister. And usually the oldest person in the family is the head of the property. And grandma died and left my dad as the head of the property. My dad has passed away. How do I get a deed for my portion? Problem. And so that you cannot get a deed in your name. You can, but it won't be effective because every other family member, aunties, uncles, cousins, sister, and brother will still own an interest in the part that your dad said that you have.
Right, right. So therein, that's kind of lets everyone know this is just the volume of the problem that we're dealing with. And so we know that from Reconstruction on through, the early 1900s, Black folks amassed like 15 million acres of land across this country, but primarily in the South. And land ownership is what gave Black farmers and families kind of a measure of independence. And there was the potential to build generational wealth. But as we also know now, Black families own less than 2 million acres of that sort of land across the country. And so this has been a particularly acute problem in the Low Country. And so I would like to talk about the reasons for the loss. And Mr. Campbell, you grew up on what is now perhaps the poster child for land loss, and in many ways land theft, and that is Hilton Head. So I would love if you would talk about what the island was like for you as a child and who owned that land.
You mean who owned the island?
Yeah, but a bit, yeah, the portions of land, right, throughout. Mm-hmm.
Well, this island is about 30,000 acres. I think we as descendants of enslaved people owned about 5 to 10,000 acres of it.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, we lived in isolation of mainland. We were all isolated. The other 20,000 acres was hunting grounds for those who came in possession of it during the Civil War, mostly northern businessmen, and they
Mm-hmm.
used it as a hunting ground. And so it was a hunting ground, and the rest of us used our 10,000 acres for a place to live, a place to grow food, a place to play ourselves, a place to be free. And so in isolation, we were living as free people out of slavery on land that we bought and actually used for livelihood.
Mm-hmm.
And so the land was important because it allowed us to be free to live in peace as well as to grow food and have a place to live until we leave it. And of course, some of us left it and went north. The Great Migration took a lot of us from the land and left it. And of course, folks who were going north, the northern folks were coming south by the 1950s. And because air conditioning had come about, mosquito control had come about, and some of these islands began to get bridged to the mainland. And so it became a nice place for people to come and recreate. And that's the transition that took place without many of us even realizing it.
Mm-hmm. And so,
but before that time, as Sister Handy said, the elders were in charge. Elders were respected. You can plant your beans over here, you can do your watermelon over here, and you can put your house over here. And that was respected.
mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's the way land was used.
And so, and so that, okay, so we were talking that, but I want to get also, Heirs Property can be something of an in-town or in some ways urban issue as well. So I would love if Councilman Mitchell, you would talk a little bit about what it was like growing up in Beaufort, you know, for you, and how many Black families there own their land.
Well, like everyone else, I want to thank everyone who facilitated this opportunity for us to have this discussion and for my participation, especially Angela Dorr for inviting me to be a part of this, and Dr. Spearin. Well, I, like Mr. Campbell, grew up in very rural Beaufort, in the northern county. I only recently moved into the city. So my experience with Heirs Property is what led me to this conversation, if you will, because my family, like so many families, lived the experience. My grandfather, my dad's father, had the land. Like Mr. Campbell said, his three brothers and his sister during the migration went off to New York. My dad stayed and farmed the land. He farmed all of the land. It was like about 25 acres. And his brothers, they all contributed to paying the taxes. I don't think they really fully realized the situation that existed with the land being in heir status. Many years later, my father was told by his father, you boys, and it's interesting, they never really talked about the girls very much. So you boys make sure you keep this land. And when Dad got to about the age that Papa told him that, Dad told my brothers and I the same thing. Whatever you do, keep this land. And it was just coincidental that, as Mr. Campbell said again, when air conditioning came, a lot of Northerners started coming back home. That was not so much the case in my immediate family situation, but Daddy wanted to, and Mom wanted to put air conditioning in the house. So my simple solution to Dad, since the house is all paid for, is say, just get a small second loan, put the air conditioning in the house. And when we went to do that, Dad discovered that the land that Papa told him to say, Rufus, go and put your house in this corner of the property, that Dad didn't own the land. Now, mind you, he did get a loan from the bank, First Federal Bank here in Beaufort at the time. He got that loan, built that house, 30-year loan, and did not own the clear title to the property. Well, fast forward to the mid-'80s when he was trying to get this loan for the air conditioning, the second, things that they tightened things down a bit. So that was fortunate in many ways because all of Dad's siblings were still living. Papa had passed, but all of Dad's siblings were still living. So Dad and I came to town. I came home. We went to a lawyer, divided the land. Everyone got their, 1/5 of the land. And, now we have, my brothers and I have clear title to our land. But I'll share something else with you. When Mom passed, her estate was probated. When Dad passed, because everything that Dad owned went to Mom, and everything that Mom owned went to the children, we got bad advice by saying there's no reason to go through probate because you the children inherited everything anyway. That was a mistake. Because while they had a will, after 10 years passed, it was like they didn't have a will. And now we, my immediate family, have the same situation that Daddy had with his siblings. And it leads to a lot of challenges. It leads to a lot of challenges, family relationships and so forth. And, fortunately, we're working through it. But I attend the tax sale for the last 3 years, working with Ms. Maria Walls, our treasurer here in the city of Beaufort. I started doing that at the request of Marion Burns, our former chairman of the board and interim director at Penn. And it's sad because that situation, which I have shared with you, happens repeatedly over and over and over again. And to see and witness someone stressed out to the max at that sale, losing their property is very, very touching.
Well, that's a good segue into that next phase of how the land loss progresses and that sale of land. So let's talk about some of the legal ways developers, have come in and continue to come in and take land, and how they use heirs property to their advantage to take that land. And I throw that open to any of you on the panel who want to attack that one.
I'll make the first comment. Many ways. One of the most prominent ways I spoke earlier of opportunistic developers. So with heirs property, it's a title where you have co-tenants. Everyone who owns an interest in a parcel of land has the right to occupy that land. And that's where the source of a lot of discourse comes from. A cousin up north has never worked the land, nor paid any taxes on the land. And now they find out that the family wants to get a loan to mortgage the property or to improve the property or even sell it. Now they come down and they want to assert some incidents of ownership. And although the family members who worked the land for years and years and generations, it's their belief that cousin from up north has nothing to do with this land because he or she never worked it or pay any taxes, but legally they have interest because they are a descendant of someone who owned an interest in the property. Now, what developers would do would divide and conquer. They would purchase an interest of one heir. That's all they need, one heir, and they become a co-tenant. As a co-tenant, you have the right to force a partition, although there is the Uniform Heirs Property Act now that, not completely, but it remedy the situation by giving notice. However, before the Heirs Property Act was enacted, we refer to it as the Clemente Pinckney Act here in South Carolina, a developer could go to court to partition and say, hey, court, I own an interest in this property. I own a 1/99th% interest in this property, and I want my interest in money, not land. The court will order a partition, a public auction before the act, and the opportunistic developer would outbid the family members for the property. Back then, we were land rich and cash poor. Our land passed through generation to generation to establish generational wealth. However, we could not realize our land in a monetary way or to use it that way because it's tied up in heirs. So developers, especially property that has water access, traditionally in Africa, the culture from West Africa that kept on with the African slaves. We had our cemeteries by the water. We involved shrimping, crabbing, fishing. That was a late way of life for us, planting rice on marshlands. So those were really sought after properties. And so as Mr. Campbell, I'm sure could testify to Hilton Head, Defusky Island, they come in, they do these partitions, build up these gated communities, the heirs are displaced. They never get what the land is worth because we hold sentimental value that's attached to our lands. I mean, it's where our ancestors were buried, where our ancestors worked the land. So that is one way. And the other way is when an heir who has no sentimental value attached to the land, they have the right to partition. So when there is no document to govern how the land should pass, it's very vulnerable to dwindle away. And the more people who dies, the more the interest becomes diluted, and it makes it even easier to lose the property. I can't hear.
Sorry about that. And then pretty soon you are owning a piece of land that's maybe about the size of a parking space.
Or no land at all.
Wow, wow. So Odetta, you have something to share with the viewers as well about how this happens, about how the loss can happen.
Thank you. And just as I'm about to pull up the share screen, I also want to link up to what Charisse was just saying, the systemic and institutional reasons why we don't have cash on hand, right? There's a massive wealth gap in this country between Black Americans and, well, white Americans and almost everybody else, right? But it's one of the widest between Black Americans and white Americans. And so that lack of liquidity is one of the institutional reasons, or that show up, and why we can't then protect ownership of our property. So, but thank you so much for just letting me quickly find, where did my little thing go? I just wanted to share a few quick slides, if I could. Maybe I'll try and make sure this is up. Sorry, everyone. 2 years in and we're still working it. All right, there we go. I just wanted to share very quickly, because Center for Community Progress has been invited into this conversation, and I just wanted to talk a little bit about what we do and about land banks. Land banks and how they become players in this heirs property question, for your viewers who may not know about that specific strategy. But community progress, we foster strong, equitable communities. Dr. McCaskill, you gave our vacant spaces into vibrant places tagline. Thank you so much. We seek to make those changes through policy and practice change at every level, local, state, and federal. So I, as a state office, I'm also part of a national team that also does federal work around policy change for vacancy. We have technical assistance. Now that I'm on the ground here in Georgia, I can come and speak to folks, not just in Georgia, but anywhere about these issues. And we have trainings and conferences nationally as well. Let me make sure. All right, great. So what I wanted to talk about is systemic vacancy, right? So there's this cycle that happens to create kind of entrenched vacancy, abandonment, and deterioration. And these issues that we're talking about today play a part in this. We will have this, we all know this history of very vibrant neighborhoods, especially among Black communities, where everything you needed was right there together. But there were fault lines inside of these communities, represented by equity challenges of discriminatory lending, unjust land use and zoning, intergenerational poverty and lack of wealth generation, and just the whole gamut of systemic racism and inequitable policies that will begin to show up when you go into this triggers stage, whether that is a Great Recession, perhaps there is a flood or a hurricane, a big change like Commissioner Mitchell was saying, Councilman Mitchell. Air conditioning, we want to take advantage of technology, right? And we think we have access to some resources to do that. But something will happen to start to really open up these fault lines within the community. And that can actually turn into, when it happens in some level of concentration, into a market change. Now you can't figure out the clear title, so maybe the property is left there. As we were able to move into other areas and neighborhoods, we saw folks leaving predominantly Black neighborhoods for other places. And the unjust policies and systemic racism are still in place, right? Those things led to inequitable appraisal and inequitable perceptions of the value of a place. If you devalue the people that live in a place, you will devalue the property itself. So once you begin to have neighborhoods that are predominantly African American, maybe the wealthier folks have moved away, and so there's now this layer of class coming into work and low income policies. And now you're starting to say this is a cheap, inexpensive place to live, but it is not also receiving the investment that it deserves. And so you start to come into this place of increased vacancy. Folks have left. This will be the folks that went up north, and maybe they have lost that sentimental connection to a piece of property, but to the municipality, it is still a presence, right? It is requiring code enforcement. It is requiring firemen to come out and check. It is requiring police action. It is a psychological and emotional drain on the people around it. They remember what it used to be, and it's upsetting to see it go down and to see the loss of the neighborhood. And those impacts show up in terms of the economics, the people themselves, and community. So when we think about a systemic problem, we like to try to think about systemic challenge interventions for it. And it can be things like, cultivating property owner compliance, that's your code enforcement. But if people no longer live there or are hard to find because they've moved away, how do you enforce the codes? And the liens just start to pile up. You may have issues around taxation. That is one of the big ways, right? Ms. Handy, right? Folks will buy tax, through tax sales, buy little interests and find their way into the discussion that should be only for a family. But the issue of transitioning property to new ownership is where land banking comes in. A land bank can be a thoughtful alternative to speculative auctions, right? When you get enough liens piled up on a property, be that unpaid taxes or code enforcement or other municipal liens, there are ways to sell it, right? And you go into tax foreclosure to try to recoup some of that money back. But a land bank is actually a strategy where you might get that to a more responsible steward who will hopefully land it in a final new disposition. So a land bank is a public authority or nonprofit. It's a quasi-governmental agency that focuses on what you see here, the conversion of VADs into equitable community assets. Just a little bit of information here about nationally where land banks kind of are, where they're concentrated. Not a whole lot across the state, across the country yet, but still 250 nationally. And this tax foreclosure process is a major system by which land banks acquire properties. So then they want to do something with it. They have wonderful powers. They can acquire the tax foreclosure. They can extinguish the liens. In some cases, they can pay money to clear title. They can hold the property tax exempt so that you're not continually layering on more taxes. And they can generate revenue. But then you come to this heirs property question, and that is where the train kind of comes to a halt. How does a land bank authority that has been given, has now stewardship of a piece of property that does not have clear title, cannot find the heirs, and are trying to do something to turn this property into either a tax generating piece of property once again through development, or give it to somebody that will do something with it, community garden, rebuild the housing, etc. This is the thing about, there are lots of Georgia land banks. Georgia is a leader in the land bank world, one of the oldest in the country to have state enabling legislation, excuse me. And we can talk more, or I'll put information in other places about the State Association of Land Bank Authorities. And this is me. So I just wanted to share a little bit about those things. But that issue of heirs property is where land banking becomes very activated. And land banks like the Chatham County City of Savannah Land Bank is really struggling because they are trying pilot projects to give folks a year to respond, to try to find family if a parcel comes into their stewardship. But it's a very delicate balance because you are talking about not just the individual family, but a whole community's sense of outrage and betrayal if a piece of property is not handled well and handled with transparency by a government agency. So this question of heirs property is one that's very important for the land bank world, which I sort of sit in. And yeah, thank you.
Yeah, but I am just so intrigued that there are all of these entities that may be able to help. But what I'm wondering is, and viewers may be wondering, is how do families get this information? How do families learn that, hey, I can either turn to a land bank or I can find the right attorney to help me with this? That's what I'd like to know. And I don't know, Mr. Campbell, if you've, continued to spread the word over time that there are people who can help you.
There is a big need for what we used to call in my old days grassroots education. We got to get to the family. we've got to get the families educated. And I mean, that means all members of the families, of these different families, got to be educated as to the various ways in which we could, first of all, use land, and ways in which we could own the land that's left that we now call heirs property. See, when I grew up, heirs property was not bad. It was good. It was a cooperative way of living. And you know, people go around now looking to organize cooperatives. We had it. And my mother and father always discussed, you know, my mother was against this together thing. But we had one horse for 3 brothers, one plow for 3 brothers, and 50 acres of land for 3 brothers. And they used this cooperatively because they got along. I mean, they loved one another. And somehow we have to now teach people what it is to own something together. I mean, how important that is. I've got 2 examples. One, at 38 acres on Hilton Head Island on the waterfront, with one member living in California wanting to bring a partition sale. And then we got another 30 acres on the waterfront, and one member of the family on Hilton Head organized all of those in New York into a corporation. They lease it out, but they got educated as to that asset and what it would mean if you could lease it out and get so much so much proceeds every month. Everybody gets a check every month, no matter where they live, and they're happy about that. And somehow we are leaving these families to vulnerabilities because they don't know. I don't know why we're not doing that. I don't know why we're not organizing families and teaching them. And we try to do that at Penn Center. It's expensive. Nobody wants to fund it. But you could do it. You could do it if you would bring the resources together. We had 300 acres on St. Helena Island that was bought in the 1920s by some 51 different men. Okay, how are we going to get this property and keep this property? We got hundreds of people out there. What we did, we got interns in the summer to find every one of those interests. And we got a lawyer who did it pro bono to incorporate those interests. Now we got a corporation called the Lands End Woodland Corporation, because that's why they bought the land to cut firewood in the 1920s. They call it the Woodland Corporation now. And these 300, all these interests are now a part of that corporation with shares. And so it's a lot of work, particularly in the rural South, to organize families and make sure that they understand this whole business of land and land laws. But if we don't do that, we are vulnerable. All the families remain vulnerable to what Ms. White just described.
And go ahead,
This is
Councilman
Mitch.
Mitchell.
Yeah, if I may jump in on that. Education is the key. I mean, this goes without saying, and almost everything, education is the key. And that's true here with this land heirs property situation. Mr. Campbell, when I became involved with the heirs property program at Penn Center, the first person I called was Mr. Campbell. He shared his wisdom, and we kind of got started. And I think we were making great progress prior to COVID. We were working with the University of South Carolina Law School with students who had a requirement for outreach and community. We conducted 2 seminars at Penn prior to COVID. So, we all know that story and how COVID has slowed things down, but hopefully we're coming out of the back end of that. that whole situation. We're looking forward to continuing that. And toward that end, elected officials, Black elected officials from the town of Hilton Head, Bluffton, Port Royal, City of Beaufort, County Council, we're working to revive this education process because it really is, we need to educate the folks to get them ahead of some of the situations that they find themselves, and certainly to avoid the situation where they find themselves at the tax sale on the first Monday in October annually. So one of the things that we did most recently, the elected officials I just mentioned, we asked Ms. Jenny Stevens from the Center for Heirs Property Preservation to come down. And she did, first we did a telephone conversation with her where she joined us during the meeting. And then in March, she actually, take that back, it was February, she actually came down. She and her attorney, the deputy director at the Center for Heirs Property, and shared a lot of information with us. So our goal at Penn is to try to be proactive, get out front, educate as much as we can, because some of the mistakes that people are making, it's not that sometimes they don't have the money. As Ms. Dr. Stevens at the Center for Heirs Property mentioned, most of this goes back to a family dynamics. Something happened. And as she said, if you get people talking, because heirs property lead to bad family relationships. If you could get the folks talking, get past the bad family dynamics, you could come to a solution. But the challenge is to get people talking, get them educated, and hopefully we arrive at best solutions, because heirs property is such a bad situation. We can only there are no perfect solutions, but we can minimize the damage going forward.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I'm going to jump in. I don't see any questions from the audience in the Q&A, so I have a few questions of my own just to start shifting gears a little bit in this conversation. But first, I'd like to make a comment. I study the literature and history of enslavement, and I noticed a parallel between the heirs property issue and enslavement. After reading hundreds of narratives of formerly enslaved persons, I can tell you that without doubt, the most heinous aspect of bondage for Black men, women, and children was not the labor, was not the idea that you would be deprived of owning anything, even yourselves. What amazed me as I started my study of slave narrative and other literature of the enslaved was how over and over again, African American men, women, and children in bondage who were lucky enough and clever enough to escape said that the worst part of slavery were the separations. The worst part of slavery was witnessing families divided from each other because of arbitrary decisions, sometimes made on a whim by the people that own them. And I couldn't help but notice a parallel between that theme of separation from people and the theme of separation from land that all of you have been talking about. And what struck me is that the land, especially when I'm listening to Emory Campbell talk about his experiences growing up, Mitch Mitchell talk about his experiences growing up, the land is almost another person. It is a living, breathing, it's not just soil. It's not just a place to build a home. Emory talked about sentimental value, and the land has so much more resonance for Black communities that it really is akin to the loss of a family member to lose the land. And that's what's striking me about this conversation. I'm hearing three themes emerge from this conversation. One is most recently how family dynamics can generate many of the problems, and that being able to sit down and talk through the issues of property ownership is an important step for Black families to take. I'm also hearing that money is an issue, liquidity, and finally education, which brings me to my question. You've mentioned a couple of solutions, the land banks, for example, for this problem, having teach-ins at the Penn Center, grassroots education, as Emory pointed out. Being a little familiar with property ownership among Native American communities, I wonder if there is any discussion of supporting young people from these coastal Black communities to become lawyers. In what ways can we create a pipeline of lawyers? This is happening in many Native American nations. They are creating their own lawyers to go and do battle against the federal government, against state governments to get back their homelands. And it is working for many of them. And I'm wondering if any of you can comment on whether or not there is even discussion of pooling financial resources, seeking monies from foundations to send our bright and motivated young people to law school so they can return to their communities and help fight to retain the land in their communities. That's my first question.
I'll take a stab at that. I believe, I know in our community, lawyers stand clear of Heirs Property. No one wants to do it. In fact, they refer them all to me. And ever since my mentor passed away, the late, great Louis Dorr, I am being flooded with Heirs Property. But here, I think my duty as an attorney is to duly inform my clients so that they could make an informed decision. And that comes with education. For example, if someone calls and said, hey, I want to do a will. I said, why do you want to do a will? What's your ultimate estate planning goals? Here are some other options. And here are how those options would affect how your property passes along and what your loved ones would have to deal with. I mean, you could have a will all day, but if it's never probated and 10 years has passed, you don't have a will. So, and I find that property owners, they aren't trustworthy of other attorneys. And I know that stems from history and racism and how land is stolen. In fact, I'm working on a case now where someone in the early 60s forged an heir's name and went to the court to do a partition. And I am trying to find a way to undo that. But I say that to say a lot of landowners are not trustworthy of the legal profession, rightfully so, if you think about what they endured throughout history. So they don't want to put things in writing. They don't want a will. They just want to keep it in the family forever, which becomes another problem. But I think as attorneys in the community, it is our duty to inform our clients, to educate them, to make a better decision versus just giving them what they initially asked for, knowing fully well that they're not fully educated to make a sound decision in regards to their family's properties.
I'd love to jump on to that just with two things. One is I did have the chance to meet the new tax commissioner in Savannah. She had a very interesting idea. I believe Sonia Jackson, I believe is her name. But Commissioner Jackson was saying, she was hearkening back to when we had the foreclosure crisis and we would have these large, convenings, bring your paperwork in, let's see if we can work something out with your lender, right then and there. You'd rent out a big arena. What if when she has a tax sale, she also has attorneys on hand or has some kind of court assistance available in the moment of a tax payment? To say, if you have your will, do you know what you might want? But to have, a licensed attorney there just to grab that moment when people are dealing with their land and property to maybe get them into at least a basic will, or get them started on the road to getting some of that documentation. So I thought that was an interesting sort of use of the tax sale system to maybe help a few more people if it's done right and planned well. And then I'm also, just sitting here thinking the community health worker model, to Mr. Campbell's point, might be a model that people understand about, what is the basic information that you can deliver to the trusted voices of a community, to your point, Charisse, about trust. Community health workers aren't necessarily MDs or anything like that, but they have been trained and they are trusted to do, to speak to their community, to go into living rooms, they'll be allowed into homes. What if we could use that model and invest in a model of community health worker to do something to what you're saying, Dr. McCaskill, about getting this information into people, but they've got to hear it from a voice that they trust. And that's probably their neighbor or some family member.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, what about, oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was thinking that before COVID, family reunions were becoming regular occurrences. Everybody had family reunions. And my thought at Penn Center was, when I was there, was to have a template for family reunions, one of which would be the whole forum on land. My cousin used to say family reunions were nothing more than a place where people came to slurp, burp, and jerk, and that we'd have to do more than that. And so the family reunion that I've been a part of, I've always had these workshops, one of which dealt with the land and the value of land and how you should preserve land and what you did with land historically. And so we're not going to be able to save everybody all at once, but we have to start, I think, with some basic efforts. One is, wherever there's a family reunion, we should be there to encourage people about their assets. And, we have two lawyers in our family, both of them women, and they got their start by listening at family reunions. And I think we can inspire people. From family reunions, we go to festivals. And at festivals, we do the same thing. And so this has to be a process by which we reach these goals. We're not going to reach them scattered. We're going to have a plan to reach these goals, which means the goal is to save family land.
But to that end, Mr. Campbell, one thing that you talked about was that it's not just to convince people that they need to save the land. You sometimes hear people saying, well, I'm not going way out there, or I've never been out there, or that's not, they don't want to, they don't want to go have to slap gnats or something, away. So the question then becomes, how do you then convince them that, hey, we can make this land productive? And I open that up.
I think we showed them the examples. We've got examples now to point to them, where families just like themselves have made land productive, either growing food or either leasing it out and produces an income. And so I think that's what we have to do, is really take a tour and show our families where things are really happening on the ground.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Mr. Campbell, when you spoke to the corporation, that really resonated with me. I'm actually a first-generation American. My father is from Grenada, the island of Grenada, but his dad put the house that he purchased for retirement into a corporation and then divided shares among his 7 children. And he did that so that when he passed, his wife would have a home and there would be children who would all pay their share of the taxes and upkeep so that grandma could be, safe in her home until she passed. And she lived into her 90s, but now the structure of the corporation exists. My dad has taken a particular interest in that house, but he can now, get the shares, or legally start to collect the shares from the other shareholders. But the island of Grenada only deals with one thing. It deals with the corporation to get paid the taxes. That's who the island of Grenada cares about, right? That government. They just want to, so they come to that one corporation. I think that's a great model. People are kind of familiar with it. While we continue to teach them your wonderful points about collective living and sharing again, like getting into this idea of sharing. And I also hope that we would be able to discuss at some point, maybe not today, how important clear title is for some things, but when are we using clear title and the lack of it to avoid larger goals? The inability to access programs like energy efficiency upgrades and other health related upgrades to homes feels like in a COVID world, we should care more about having street after street of safe upgraded homes. And so why is title a requirement to accessing those kinds of programs? I'd love to talk about how we could pick that apart. I understand if you need clear title for mortgages or for second loans, maybe that's an important reason, but I think we have inserted this idea of clear title and ownership, to your point about collective and understanding collective ownership, in places that is now no longer serving our larger shared public health goals about everyone should be healthy and have a place to be healthy. Thank you.
There's a saying that heirs property is only good for the tax collector, and while there have been a few things that has happened recently that mitigates that just a bit, for the most part that's true. And in terms of trying to make this land productive, some of my involvement, well, a lot of my involvement in the heirs property program at Penn is, basically, from a selfish perspective, because I've lived and I'm living that experience, if you will. So it's very dear to me, and it's easy to sink my teeth in. I learn a lot while I'm trying to help others too. But in terms of making the land productive, again, using my personal experience as the example, Dad passed, and we of that 25 acres, my siblings and I, 9 of us, we inherited about almost 5 acres, and then if you pile upon that the zoning that the county government did, back in the 90s in Beaufort County, zoned the area that we live in T2 rule, which means that you can only put one improvement on 3 acres of land. Well, that does a lot to devalue your land. But as my brother and I, saw other folks in a similar situation where they were going to lose their property, and we had opportunities to buy property both within our family and without. Now we had this land, and we were just paying taxes on it. And then, we learned about the agricultural status, where if you have 5 acres or more, or if you have less than 5 acres but contiguous to property that's already in agricultural status, you can add it. We went from paying thousands of dollars in taxes to paying hundreds of dollars in taxes. And then we said, oh, well, we're paying less taxes, that's great. But what else can we do with it? So we formed, as was mentioned earlier, not a corporation, but an LLC, right? Why? Because my brother and I are kind of like daddy-ish age that he was when he talked to us about these things. We realized that if we pass on, our kids are going to be fighting the same battle. So now that property is in this LLC legal entity, they can leverage that and do things with it. So well, we got an LLC. That's great too. Property goes on, and kids still have to pay taxes. How are they going to get to a point where this land is producing something? So enter Miss Dr. Jenny Stevens in the Center for Heirs Property Preservation, where we realized that the likelihood of our children farming the land is slim to none. So we created a tree farm, and working with the Center for Heirs Property, which we didn't know. I mean, we were literally, I didn't know anything about it, but you can learn, and there are people ready to help you. And they did help us. And just recently, actually 2 weeks ago, we finally put trees on that land. 10 to 15 years from now, our children will be able to get profit off of that land, to leverage that land, to do other things with that land, so that it's an income for them as opposed to a cost. that's the kind of word I think we really, are trying to get out to the community in terms of education.
Right. Yeah, I'm heartened by hearing what both you and Mr. Campbell have said, because I like you said, speaking from personal experience, I have a grandmother who saw this coming and saw her brother, God bless him, wasn't keeping up the taxes, so they paid, and then they all sat together as family members and they partitioned that land legally themselves. So each sister got a certain number of acres. And so most of that land we still have, but there are bits of it. Some people have sold it off, but we haven't lost the whole thing. And what remains is they lease out to different farmers. So we each get a check every, like 6 months or so, we get a check from that agricultural income. But I would like to know, there's and I believe, Cherese, you mentioned the Uniform Partition of Heirs Property Act that Thomas Mitchell, professor out of Texas A&M, championed and pushed through, and kind of got a MacArthur Fellow grant out of it. But I would love to hear how that works in helping to stop this sale and loss of land.
Oh, Cherese, and what the act does is, number one, it emphasizes due process, notice. When you're dealing with heirs property, there are known and there are unknown heirs that could be all over the United States, the world. And what the act does, it says if an heir is bringing the property to the courts to partition, the other heirs must have notice. Notice is very important. If those heirs do not have notice, then the case cannot go any further. It would be dismissed. Notice to the fact that they have the first right before the property is ordered to be sold on the public auction or the open market. That heir or any heirs have the right to purchase the partitioning heir's interest. So what that means is that, for example, if I want to sell my interest in my family's property and I have a 5% interest, I have to give the heirs notice and say, hey, I want to partition my interest. Those heirs or any heir has the opportunity to say, no, don't sell the property on the open market. I will purchase your interest and I will get credit for the interest that I already have. So they would purchase my interest, 5% for the market value, 5% of the market value. Then case is over. Secondly, the act, it requires any partitioning heir who wants to partition to the property to post a sign on the property. Notice to all heirs, this property is being partitioned. You have a right to purchase the interest, and that heir would have the opportunity to go to court. So often families partition property, and our law says we could notice people by publication, placing something in the newspaper for 3 consecutive weeks. And if someone lives in California who's interested in the property, how would they know that the property is being partitioned? So each heir who owns an interest would have the opportunity before any person who is a third party who's not a family member to purchase that heir's interest. Because the theory is if an heir is offering their interest for sale, it shouldn't matter who purchased the interest. And the law wants to preserve property. The theory is to preserve property and to give notice. There's some other, statutory guidelines that makes it a tedious process, but it works as to allowing the heirs to purchase that heir's interest to keep the property in the family instead of a third-party developer displacing the family heirs to the family property.
And since it was adopted in 2017, you've seen it work?
Oh yeah, I had, since it was adopted, I worked on about 5 cases under the Heirs Property Act. And most of those cases were defending the other heirs when there is one heir who wants to sell the property to a third party. And I defend the other heirs by giving them an opportunity to purchase that heir property. What happens is now what the developers do, they would go to a family member and they won't purchase their interest because the developer knows if they purchase their interest and they try to partition, then an heir could come and purchase that developer's interest, only that fractional interest. So what they would do is have the family member bring the property up for partition, hoping that, you know, the heirs won't exercise their option to purchase, sell it on the open market, and guess who, you know, signs the contract? It's the developer. So that's one way the developer tries to get around it, but the act puts a hold on that, allowing the heirs the first right to purchase the property.
Okay, okay. And one thing that you mentioned about the when they used to put, you know, ads in the local newspaper, I can personally say I have cousins who live in New Jersey who still have a subscription to the little town's newspaper. They actually read the ads and watch because they're like, well, I know so-and-so didn't pay his taxes. We don't want to lose it. So that might be.
Oh, yes. And I have, you know, I've heard of instances where attorneys who are quieting these titles are partitioning the action. When they hire a process server or investigator, they would say, hey, you know, don't try too hard to find these people. You know, we would rather serve them by publication. It happens. It happens because we all know publication in a local newspaper is not going to reach all of the heirs to a piece of property.
No. Okay. And Barbara, Barbara, you said you had another question you wanted to.
Well, in many ways, it's been answered. I really appreciate the granular description, Charisse, that you gave of the Heirs Property Act. And I know that we are going to do our best to circulate this recording afterwards. And I would welcome any of you who are engaged in public education about heirs property to contact us at the Willson Center if you'd like to use this recording going forward, any of you, in educating the public, please do, because this is of vital importance. And we want to change the direction of so many of these sad cases. I am amazed at the not only amount of solutions that all of you have been able to offer, but the variety of solutions. And I was surprised, but not offended when you commented on maybe creating a pipeline of lawyers is not necessarily the first solution that we should reach for. What I found compelling about the solutions that you offered is that all of them focus on building community. This is a community issue. I think we've defined this heirs property issue a little differently from how the public often understands it. The public often goes away, I know I did, thinking that heirs property is a matter of an individual family squabbling or an individual family bickering. But this is a community issue because what happens to an individual family's land, as all of you have pointed out, resonates so much more beyond that individual family. It affects these towns, it affects these rural areas, it affects how people feel about where they live when they walk past a plot of land that is all gnarly and untended, when they walk past, as Odetta pointed out, a house. My mother is experiencing this with a vacant house next door. When you walk past a vacant house that's been vacant for many years and you remember how it once was, that affects the community's quality of life. So I find this conversation enormously valuable for the solutions that you've offered. And I hope that we can, at some point, as has been suggested, do a follow-up because we are just touching the surface. We only have a little time that's remaining, so rather than ask another question, what I'd like to do is just go around the Zoom and ask each one of the panelists finally to weigh in one last time. Going forward, what do we need to attend to in relationship to this issue? I mentioned a few themes: money, education, trust has emerged. What should we attend to? Or, to put it another way, what can individuals do? Particularly those of us that might not be directly affected. I'm learning today that we all are affected. We all have a stake in this game. Those statistics about how the ownership of land among African American communities nationally has plummeted, those statistics are chilling. They're chilling. And they affect all of us as African Americans, all of us as Americans. When we have one group that is so far behind in terms of the wealth gap, as we learned during this pandemic, right? As we learned during this pandemic, these inequities may seem as if they are affecting one group disproportionately, but they resonate with us all. So if we could just go around the Zoom, I'm looking at Odetta because she's to the right of me, but just going around the Zoom and asking each of you to weigh in, what for you, just one idea, one solution, one frame of mind to be the takeaway from today's panel for our audience members.
Gosh, thank you so much. Again, I have just learned as far more than I gave, I know, participating today. So thank you. Maybe I would take a futurist point of view. African people in America are the founders of futurist thinking, right? We were always thinking about the future so we could survive to get to that day, right? So what is the future? I'm on TikTok now, and I see a lot of young people trying to reclaim homesteads, get back into homesteading. There are young people and generations coming up who want to be stewards of their family land or some piece of land again. So finding them and figuring out how we educate and get into community with the young people and think in that futurist kind of way. I think also lets us think expansively about the range of solutions as you've discussed. Some we need today and some are about building pipelines and other ways of thinking in the future. Thank you so much.
I do not think we could move forward with any aspect of heirs property and the preservation of property without education and communication. We've already expounded on how education would positively promote preserving family property, but also communication. I find that, families are having discourse amongst themselves, with property. You sit down at a family dinner and discuss it. Talk about it first before you come and pay an attorney, hundreds of dollars an hour to resolve with the family members who has an intimate relationship with one another would more effectively resolve. And once those issues are resolved, then you would seek legal counsel to memorialize those decisions in a writing to preserve the property. But we waste so much time and money arguing amongst each other, and the attorneys are making so much money by communicating back and forth between the heirs and getting in contact with each other because there's no family communication. And I think at least attempt to communicate with one another and resolve the issue amongst the family before seeking the legal system.
I think I ditto what those two ladies have said. And I'm thinking that maybe we should focus on young people, children and young people, children and youth. The arts have been a great way of educating our young people. Jonathan Green puts out these big calendars every year. He's a Gullah man from Beaufort County. And all of his, just about all of his images are to the land or to the rivers. And if he could do something for young kids to introduce them to the love of land, their family land, something about the history of that land. They could influence the elders, us elders. Young people taught me how not to litter. He said, "Don't throw that out, Daddy." He said, "Don't litter." You know, taught us how to stop smoking. You know, and so I think we've got to concentrate on the young people with images as well as history of the land. Thank you.
I guess I'm next. Okay. I think the key is just education. You know, Attorney Handy touched on it. I think we all touched on it. But I think we just need to, as we are comfortable being in one's presence, to take advantage of every opportunity to educate our folks on means available to try to manage their land in a more predictable way, and a way that will allow it to be passed on, you know, safely to the heir. I mean, without it being an heirs property situation, but to the heir. I can think of some ways right now in terms of festivals that are up and coming that maybe we could take advantage of that, and you know, starting to get the information out. I do want to share one thing with us. It's not directly in response to the question, but something that has changed recently is the ability for heir property to receive disaster relief. We at Penn have been working with attorney Hollis, Melvin Hollis. He's been educating us on work that he has done. He's been involved with FEMA for quite a while, and actually stood up to, apparently Savannah State has a very promising FEMA educational program there, and he stood that up. But that's something because before, you know, and you know, obviously in the Low Country we're subject to hurricanes and flooding and other natural disasters, and before those folks affected could not get any relief from FEMA, but now they can.
Right.
Wonderful.
Okay. Well, I'm not a panelist, but but a participant.
You can still weigh in if you'd like.
I will just wind up by saying, get people to see the land as a blessing, not a burden, and teach them that it can be productive.
Mhm. And I would add the word healing there. I'm an avid gardener, and I've been out moving that soil around, and I can't tell you, after a long, stressful day, just putting your hands in the dirt, planting seeds, watching them grow, feeding yourself and your community and your family, it is such a rejuvenating process for me. And by way of Emory's comments about getting the young people, as he said, involved, I think one step to take to learn loving the land is to get people into those gardens. And boy, do we have an opportunity now more than ever with inflation, making those vegetable prices, even vegetables, shoot up. This is an opportunity. People are thinking, what can I do to cut costs for food? Well, even if you have a little pot, I tell my neighbors, you can grow tomatoes in a pot. It's amazing what you can grow without even having a plot of land. But if you have a little plot of land, you can grow so much. And it is a transformative experience, and it's another way to feel connected. I am heartened by this conversation. This conversation is about community. It's about connecting. It's about coming together again after 2.5 years of being pulled apart in many ways. And I'd like to thank all of you, Attorney Handy, Attorney MacLeish-White, Councilman Mitchell, Dr. Campbell, Ms. Bentley, future colleague at UGA. Thanks all of you for coming into this panel today, and I am excited about the many more that will come. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us.
Mhm.